Hello, everyone. David here. Welcome back to the DGR podcast. I hope you're all doing well. This is episode number 78. I am going to do a solo again today. I'm going to answer, I think, just one question, which I mentioned on the last podcast or the previous podcast, or a couple of podcasts ago, that I was going to try and answer, and then I probably went on too long. So it's around the use of contrast training, French contrast training, specifically in training, but also in rehab. And I'm obviously going to take a slightly more rehab view on it. But anytime I say at all our workshops, anytime I mention the word rehab, if you're at a workshop and you don't work in rehab, just think training, just substitute the word training. Anytime I say the word rehab, it's the same thing. It's just meeting someone where they're at and mushing them down, pushing them forward, meeting them where they're at, making them a bit better, meeting them where they're at, making them a bit better, identifying what the goal is, identifying what they need to work on the most, and just hammering that thing into submission, and improving that way. So we are going to answer that question. I don't think I have too much else to talk about. I have other questions, but I would just want to stick to one, I think, today. I have some. If you're watching me on YouTube or whatever, I'll be probably looking down a little bit because I'm going to make this kind of semi-practical. So I have some examples of. So when we talk about contrast training, I have some like practical examples of some exercises that you can pair together, and I'll talk about the pros and cons of potentially using these and the different types of things that you can use. So I just scribbled them down there like 2 minutes ago. I'll be looking down just to make sure I don't confuse myself. So the question is, do you use French contrast training in rehab? I've seen you post some examples of it in the past. If you've seen me post examples, then you know that I kind of use it, but I wouldn't call it French contrast training. I use a couple of different contrasts, which I don't really. I call them. I might call it contrast training if I'm writing down on a program for a client so that they understand. But I don't necessarily, because like when you say French contrast, that's a very specific type of contrast, and I'll use different types of contrasts. And as always, like because I'm in my own because I work for my own business, I work for myself, I can call it whatever I want. Two, I try not to like box myself in. So I say it's French contrast, then someone has already defined what French contrast is, and I don't want to mess with that definition or that terminology because that's not fair and not useful for anyone else. So like I have something that I use called fatigue contrast. I have like joint angle specific contrasts, and then you have a more traditional French contrast type of training. And I have posted some examples in the past, and don't worry, you don't need to go looking for them. I'll scribble down a couple of the examples. But yeah, so firstly, what is French contrast? So practically speaking, it's where you do something. Let's say you have, traditionally I think people would have like 4 exercises in a row. They would have a heavy lift, they would have a plyometric, they would have a weighted jump, and then another type of plyometric usually. So a heavy lift, a plyo, a weighted lift, a weighted jump, and then a plyo. So for example, you could go something very, very heavy. And don't hold me to this exactly because I'm not far from an expert on French contrast training, but just this is my perception, and then I'll show you, I'll explain when I might use it. So you could do something very heavy. So like a high percentage of your 1RM squat, like 80, 90, 95% maybe, whatever, just a high percentage, something heavy. So you could think of a squat, all right? You could think of doing then, pairing that, or straight after that, doing something pretty fast. So that could be just like a double leg pogo. You could think about then doing something kind of heavy and kind of fast. So that could be a squat jump. And then you could think of doing something super fast, and that could be like a band assisted jump. So that's what you'll see a lot of people doing, or a sprint even could be in there. So the idea really there is like something very heavy, then something fast, something heavy-ish and kind of fast, which is maybe the weighted jump, and then something super fast. So it's hard for me to know how fast to actually go with this. But yeah, there's a contrast. So think of a contrast, think of a scale. If I just drew a line on a page, and then on one end of the line I wrote hot, and the other end I wrote cold, you now have a contrast between hot and cold. Think of, I draw a line on a page and I have heavy and I have light on either ends of the line. Like, you now have a contrast. There's something heavy, there's something light down there. Think of a line on the page and I write internal rotation on one end and external rotation on the other end, and then draw a line through that line in the middle. Like, neutral is in the middle. So a lot of people will train a lot of the time in this neutral-ish type of zone in everything. So like, they'll do things that are kind of heavy-ish, like they're relatively heavy, not super slow, not super fast, not through super large range of motion, not super high reps, not super low reps. They just stay in the middle all of the time, not working like to extreme exhaustion, not working too easy. And staying in the middle is a nice place, like roughly staying in the middle and oscillating in and around there is not the worst training strategy, but it can be nice to use contrasts and give people contrasts to help them feel what something like very heavy and something very light is, what something very fast is, and what something very slow is, what like large range of motion is versus what shorter range of motion is, that type of thing. So like, yeah, even just to feel the difference between that, which sounds obvious, but like, since we only, like, in life we only know what happy is because we can be sad. So there's a contrast in life, there's a duality of man. Everything exists, night and day, light and dark, happy and sad, heaven and hell. Like, there's always a contrast there. So we can use those contrasts in our training as well, potentially. We can I like to contrast things as well. When I'm trying to teach people how to relax, I'll use a contrast where I'll get them to squeeze as hard as possible. If it's a certain muscle or everywhere, I'll get them to squeeze really hard first and then relax. Now they have a contrast of, oh yeah, my muscle was on before, but I thought it wasn't. Now I squeeze even harder and I realize, yeah, and now I know for sure that's definitely on. That's one end of the spectrum. Now I can let it go, and now I know that's definitely off, rather than this perpetually living in this like low level state of tension that is not really aiding me. I'm teaching you, here's what a lot of tension feels like, and here's what very, very little tension feels like. So like, contrasting, I'm not talking about French contrast now, just contrasting sensations in your training can be really, really nice. You can have high days and low days. You can have days where like you lift a lot of shit really heavy and then you move a lot very fast the next training day. You can have days where like, yeah, you're driving a lot of tension one day, and then days where you're really staying relaxed and focused on fluidity and rhythm and relaxation another day. So it can be nice to contrast things in your training. It's definitely nice. And I think people don't contrast things enough, and they get stuck in one kind of perpetual state of, I'm moving with like a decent amount of tension through a very similar range with very similar movement strategies all of the time. So the idea with like a French contrast then is that like each exercise, quote unquote, potentiates the next one. And I don't really agree with that thought process. I think why it like came about in the first place is S&C coaches in particular trying to be fancy, trying to justify themselves and their job and saying, like, if we do something really heavy, then the next exercise is going to feel like really fast because the weights aren't there, and that's going to help people jump higher, and that's going to help people do X, Y, and Z. And I'm not saying it's not. Of course it could, but like, the more obvious answer is like, if you just practice jumping more, you're going to jump higher. If you want to jump higher, you need to practice jumping high. So that's the more obvious answer. And you don't need to look for the very short-term gains of like, okay, I can jump 2% higher when I do a really heavy lift first. I want you to be able to jump 2% higher all the time because you've trained jumping a lot, and then you're just able to access that. I don't want you to have to like always potentiate something. So Potentiation also is a little bit of a myth in the industry, I think, because like a good warm up is just potentiation. Turning up the music is potentiation. Being in a weight room or a training environment, a competitive environment with your friends, that will make you jump higher or potentially sprint faster or lift heavier. So like there's many ways of potentiating. Speaking to someone, telling them you're looking jacked today, or like you played so well last weekend, I couldn't believe how high you jumped. Like, what? Show me that. Like, that's potentiation. That's building confidence. That's getting people to believe in themselves. Maybe screaming as loud as you can and like really clapping your hands and getting going. That's potentially potentiation as well. So, oh, hang on, that is ringing me. Decline. It flicks off my screen because my phone is connected to my laptop. Hopefully I'm still with you. So like the idea with a French contrast is each exercise potentiates the next and helps with the next, and that contrast helps give some kind of a stimulus, even though, and I'm not saying it doesn't, but I'm also saying like I don't know how true that is, and I don't know if it's just being fancy for the sake of being fancy. I know for certain people like that is the case. It's being fancy for the sake of being fancy, and yeah, it might not be needed, I would say. Yeah, there's another like there's loads of examples of being fancy for the sake of it. Like there's examples of, if you know what RPR is, where you're like rubbing on certain spots and you need to find the exact specific spot for your muscle that is quote unquote like inhibited. So you need to rub aggressively on your sternum, and that's going to stop you getting hamstring injuries or something like that. Like all this stuff is just trying to substitute or find a way of saying like, I know secrets that you don't know, you need me. You're training like just sprinting and jumping and making sure you're moving really well and doing a good, like just a good warm up and recovering well isn't enough. You need to know the secret sauce, and that secret sauce comes in the form of me programming this specific flow of exercises which potentiates the next in specific percentages and specific time durations and sets and rep schemes. That all of that could be the case, but Occam's razor, the more obvious answer is you just sprint more if you want to get faster, you jump more if you want to jump higher, you lift more if you need to get stronger. And it doesn't, if you're consistent with those things and you don't fall into the trap of doing too much and doing it sloppily and doing it in a way that forces negative transfer, then like more than likely you're going to get benefits over time rather than trying to potentiate and steal a short-term benefit that could or could not, may or may not stick around. But yeah, just the simple answer is usually the best. That's what I would say there. So some kind of pros of that type of approach is it gets people doing contrasts, which is, I don't mean French contrast, but it gets people doing contrasts in their training. So they're lifting something heavy and they're lifting something light. Good idea? I would say so. Not always now, don't get me wrong, but like, yeah, they're starting to feel different things. It gets people jumping fast and it gets people jumping very fast. Good idea? Yes, I would say at least they're jumping in the first place. It gets people potentially sprinting. It gets people potentially stronger. So there's loads of good benefits there. We used to do a French contrast with our football team probably like 8 years ago. We had a really good S&C coach, and I think he started to dabble in a lot of this stuff several years ago now, 8-10 years ago. And we were doing like, yeah, heavy lift, a box jump, maybe a weighted jump, and then like some pogos or hurdle jumps or things like that. So like, for me, it was definitely fun. I really enjoyed that. It was super good. I think it helped me. Do I think it was because of the contrast or the flow of exercises? Probably not. I think it was because he got us lifting in different ways, he got us jumping in different ways, and he got us having fun and being a bit competitive with each other. And training wasn't boring, and it wasn't like it always was, which is like a like squat, B hinge, C, whatever, so like it mixed it up and it was fun. So, and it got us lifting at different intensities and jumping in different ways. Fun is a key word there, and variety in your training is a key word as well, and being athletic is a key word. So here's some ways that I would use it, potentially use that type of stuff. And yeah, I'll give you some examples. So for someone, let's say you're doing a knee rehab with someone, ACL. Excuse me. There's fluff always on my microphone, and I think me talking gets a little bit of the fluff to go into my throat somehow, and it gets caught. I can feel it like drying out my mouth or something. So, okay, so like ACL rehab, let's say you're getting to the later stages and you have done heavy squats. You have done jumping in a variety of ways. And you have done all the exercises that I'm going to list out already, and they're competent at those exercises. And now you want to mix up the stimulus a little bit. So, like, traditionally, you would not traditionally, I won't say traditionally, maybe it is traditionally or not, but like, usually I would put my plyo stuffs first in a session, while so we do a good warm up and then I put my plyo stuff there, so that, because we're trying to jump, we're trying to be as reactive as possible. We want to avoid, like, if we're trying to be faster off the ground and jump higher, then we don't want a ton of fatigue in the system when we're trying to do that. So you can, usually I would do that first, but the fact of the matter is, if you're going back playing a sport like soccer, rugby, Gaelic football, AFL, basketball, anything like that, like, you need to still be able to be fast off the ground and jump, and with a lot of fatigue in the system, where you're tired. So your lungs are tired, your brain is tired, your nervous system is tired, and maybe local muscles are tired, your calves are tired, your quads are tired, whatever. It's late in the game. That's when a lot of ACL injuries are going to happen. That's when a lot of injuries in general are going to happen, when fatigue sets in. So it's a tricky kind of one, where you're thinking, okay, I want them to do their plyos early on in a session so they're the highest quality possible, but also, like, do I still need someone late on in a game or in a training session where they're back with their team to be able to still be elastic and springy and have good quality movement when they're fatigued? Yes, of course I do. So, like, you want to be doing some of your plyos under fatigue so that they can feel that, manage that fatigue, and still produce really high quality movement under fatigue. And that's another skill in and of itself. Being able to be tired is a skill. Being able to move well is a skill. Being able to be really springy off the ground is a skill. But then putting all those three things together, being able to be springy, being able to move really well, and be tired while I'm tired, is kind of another skill. Now, if you're not springy, then you're definitely not springy when you're tired. If you can't move well at all, then you definitely can't move well when you're tired. But if you can do those things, then you want to make people tired and then force them to do those things as well. That's another skill. You need to expose them to that stimulus. So let's say you've done all that, you've made people springier, they're looking pretty good, they're squatting well, blah, blah, blah. So potentially then I just looked at like a previous contrast. This is probably more like a French contrast, but it's actually, no, it's probably not, but it's more similar, let's say, than different. So you could put in a heavy squat, heavy barbell back squat. You're going to get a lot of quad there, knee dominant type of movement. Obviously, your hips are working as well. Then I paired it then with so the second exercise then is a continuous counter movement jump. So fast, but not super elastic. So like in the heavy squat, we're going down to parallel, or hopefully breaking parallel if we can. In the counter movement jump, double leg, you're going to be sinking down and pushing back up again, somewhere around similar joint angles. Still a muscular movement, but we're jumping up and down, and we're going for reps there, not too many reps. Then I actually have a knee iso push. So you're actually going into a barbell, doing an isometric and pushing really hard there into a barbell in this mid stance type of position on a single leg. And then we're going into a single leg drop jump, or a few single leg drop jumps. Okay. So that flow of exercises looks like this. and this is just a complete like example that I wrote for a client. So that I had there and I was able to pull out. So don't take this as gospel or say, I'm not even saying that you should do this with your clients. I'm not even saying, I'm just giving you an example. So there you have a heavy squat, a continuous counter movement jump, a knee iso push, and then a single leg drop jump. So 4 exercises. Okay. So in a French contrast, you might think something very heavy. There I have a heavy barbell back squat. Something pretty fast. There I have a continuous counter movement jump. Not too many reps, just a few. Something heavy and fast. A lot of the time people will put in a squat jump there with light enough dumbbells, but heavy enough to slow your jump down, obviously. But instead, I had, for whatever reason at the time, I had a knee iso push. So it's an isometric push. So you could say heavy and you could say fast, but obviously it's an isometric. There's no movement. So it's not fast, but where the intent is high. We're trying to push as hard as possible. We're trying to be as fast as possible. So it's high intent. And then something pretty fast afterwards, which is a single leg drop jump. I have, like here in my example that I gave earlier in the French contrast, something super fast, a band assisted jump. I just don't like band assisted jumps. I don't think I've ever used them in the last 5 years. Certainly I use them as an athlete myself, and I can't remember. Some client I know will come out of the woodwork and prove me wrong, but I can't remember any time in the last 5 years I've programmed band assisted jumping for anyone. So I'm not a big fan of those. That's another conversation. Guys, if you're sick of using calf and tibialis raises with yourself or your clients, hoping that they will work, secretly knowing that they won't, then check out our foot program in the show notes. I'll teach you how I rehab and train all of my clients, how to unlock their rear foot and their ankle, how to pressurize their midfoot, how to load and strengthen their forefoot, how to build a connection from the foot to the hip, how to progress through plyometrics. It will open up so many tools in your toolbox and completely transform how you view lower leg training. So check it out. You won't regret it. So that's more like a knee dominant contrast that you could use with someone who is good at all those exercises. And now you want to use those exercises where you're pairing them. You're doing like a squat, which a heavy squat, and then into a counter movement jump. So like you're pairing them together. You're doing 4 in a row where there's different amounts of fatigue, different amounts of like my nervous system is a bit more upregulated now. I'm not doing them to potentiate the next exercise necessarily. I'm doing them to cause you to have some kind of a different sensation in your body when you do the next exercise. It's not about like, oh, now you're able to jump 2% higher in the counter movement jump. Great if you can, but I'm not doing it for that reason. I'm doing it so that you can do a counter movement jump having done a previous exercise, and now your body feels different. So that's why I'm doing it. So that would be like a knee dominant one. Here's a hip dominant example that I've written for another client. More hip dominant and more knee dominant. There's obviously a lot of hip and a lot of knee in both. So exercise 1, we have, obviously we said before, something heavy or something very heavy. So trap bar deadlift. Exercise 2, something pretty fast, broad jump I have there. So similar joint angles. If you get into a trap bar deadlift and broad jump, similar-ish joint angles. Exercise 3, we have here something heavy-ish and fast. I had there a Bosch clean. I probably wouldn't use that now. I've gone away from those exercises. But I think if you were someone that likes those exercises, you could do a Bosch clean will probably work there, because we're thinking something like heavy-ish and fast at the same time. So the previous example was a squat jump with some weights in your hands, obviously. This example, more hip dominant, is a Bosch clean. To be honest, I would probably just do a clean now, double leg clean. But yeah, I had that more like double leg, and then the Bosch clean goes into like a single leg variation, and then the fourth exercise is a triple hop for distance. So hop, hop, hop. So right. So yeah, so that hip dominant one, trap bar deadlift, broad jump, Bosch clean, triple hop. So there's like a knee dominant one and a hip dominant one, and the contrast, not for potentiation, not to make people jump higher, but to make people do exercises while their body feels different from having done the previous exercise. So to expose them to different levels of fatigue and stuff like that. not just fatigue, but different levels of stimulus, different levels of upregulation, different levels of just my nervous system feels different now, having done that exercise, now that I'm doing the next exercise. So that's a couple of examples where I would use that in rehab. And I think like that's fun too. That starts to feel like training. That starts to feel like more like, yeah, I'm like in when you're playing soccer, you're playing Gaelic football, you're out in the field. You're not just like, I don't just do all my sprints, then I do all my change of directions, then I do all my shooting, then I do all my tackling. Like really the game is all of these things being mixed in together. And I need to be able to shoot and then tackle. I need to be able to change directions so that I can get past my player to shoot. So like it's pairing all these things together and being good at them in isolation, but then in integration with each other. So another one then, it could be a joint angle specific contrast. So this is another contrast that I have used with someone, and I'll explain it. So, or I'll give you the example of the exercises. Again, I know this is an audio, so hopefully, like everyone knows when I say trap bar deadlift, hopefully you know what that means. When I say broad jump, hopefully you know what that means. When I say Bosch clean, hopefully you know what that means. When I say triple hop for distance, hopefully you know what that means. So joint angle specific, hopefully you know what a kickstand hinge is. You've seen me post a lot about that. This is when I say kickstand hinge, it's not how anyone else coaches it. It's how I coach it. Now, if they've learned from me, they're coaching it in the same way, but it's not an RDL is basically what I'm saying. It's not a kickstand deadlift or a staggered stance. It's a kickstand hinge. There's only one type of that only one way of doing that. Okay. Then you could have a swan hop. So Matt McInnes Watson has a plyometric exercise called a swan hop. So you're kind of hinged over, you're on your right leg and you're hopping. You're in like an RDL position where your left leg is back up behind you and you're doing a hop there. So there's kickstand hinge. Now this can be a kickstand hinge where you're going heavy. This is what I mean. Like this is heavy because it's the first exercise. If we're following like more the French contrast style, is something heavy first, then something kind of fast. So kickstand hinge, load it up with a trap bar, go heavy. Swan hop, because something kind of fast, not very fast at all, but similar knee angle, still in mid stance, still like a little bit more like you're getting a bit more hamstring and glute there. And then I have the third exercise, a hamstring bridge overcoming isometric. So you're lying with your shoulders on one bench, your heel on another bench. You have a slight bend in your knee. Again, like mid stance type of knee position. You're driving your heel down into the bench and you're driving your hips up into a fixed object, which could be my hands on your hips and all my body weight pushing down into you, or it could be a barbell or something like that. Excuse me. Another bit of fluff. Actually, I might have a sip of my Lucasade Sport. Very nice. So yeah, hamstring bridge overcoming isometric. And then the fourth exercise could just be a hop again. Okay. You could go maybe for distance again, rather than like going straight up in the air for your hop, because that would be more knee dominant. If you travel for distance in your hop, you're starting to get more of this like kind of stretch and rolling foot contact. So you're using your hip. Your knee is definitely working, your ankle is definitely working a lot more, but you're starting to get a lot more hip than just if you were going straight up and down in the air, more vertical. So this one is more horizontal. So there are like joint angle specific is this would be like a mid stance specific, semi specific, I should say, which is important. Mid stance semi specific contrast where we could do it to load someone's hamstring. We could do it to load their knee in that joint angle. We could do it to load their ankle in that joint angle, their calf in that joint angle, their glute in that joint angle, or their hip, I should say, in that joint angle. So yeah, the cool thing is when you're in those joint angles, the knee, the ankle, and the hip are all in that mid stance position. So you don't need to be super specific with like which one. But yeah, that would be a joint angle specific one. So that's exercise 1, kickstand hinge. Exercise 2, swan hop. I think that's what Matt calls it. Exercise 3, hamstring bridge overcoming isometric. Exercise 4, a vertical hop for distance. For distance. I don't like saying for distance because that means people disregard all like cues of are all smoothness of the hop, and they just like try and smash themselves to go as far as possible. So I wouldn't usually say for distance within my programs or when I'm coaching, but just for the sake of you guys listening, that's what I'm saying. And then another example would be a fatigue contrast. So some of you have probably heard me speak about this a couple of times. I've spoken about fatigue contrast on another podcast several years ago. I think it was a guest podcast. I've spoken about it on Instagram stories. I've spoken about it on Instagram in general, I think a couple of times, not that often. So any like newer followers in the last 18 months or so probably hasn't heard me talk about it. But a fatigue contrast would be something that sorry, just pen is leaking a bit. Fatigue contrast would be, let's say someone has knee pain and we have them up to a certain level, but like when they do a hop, they still get knee pain. Or yeah, let's just stick with that example for now. It's not horrible knee pain. It's still just knee pain, but they're still able to do some hopping, but like it just feels a bit gunky and they're unsure. I think you can use fatigue contrast to like, because sometimes with pain, you're almost like expecting it. You have the same body and you have the same body and that body is expecting it, because every time I'm in this joint angle in this position, I get this pain. So like I'm expecting that to come. So we can kind of scramble that signal a little bit and say we can use a fatigue contrast where actually now you have a different body when you do it. So what that means is, let's say you have knee pain. I'm going to try and do a single leg hop, which is hop is single leg anyway. But let's say I'm going to do a single leg tuck jump, and every time you land, you're getting that little bit of pain. So we can kind of scramble that signal, I think, a little bit, which is, I know that sounds super unscientific, and it is super unscientific. So like I acknowledge that, and this is super unscientific. This is not something that's been studied. I think the last time I spoke about this, like physios were asking me for the research to back up what I was saying. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, I'm not saying this is research. I'm just saying you can potentially use this as an option. So, so you have knee pain and you want to do a single leg tuck jump or single leg tuck jumps. You can use something called a fatigue contrast, which I call a fatigue contrast. So let's say you do a heavy leg extension or a leg extension. You go for 20 reps, you smoke your quad. You go and do a tuck jump, then you now have a different body than you did before, because that quad is very fatigued. It's called a fatigue contrast for a reason. We want to bring the quad like to the edge of failure, and then do the exercise. You might not jump as high or anything like that. That's fine. That's not the idea. Then we'll go heavy leg extension. This is complete random example now. So don't just quote me or take me up on this example. Literally, I wrote this down 30 seconds ago, but I've used examples like this or kind of plans like this with people. So heavy leg extension, 20 reps. Single leg tuck jump, 20 whatever reps. Foam roller bridge oscillations, 20 reps or however many reps until like they're basically go to failure. Back to the single leg tuck jump, 20 reps. Single leg calf raise, 20 reps or to failure. Single leg tuck jump, 20 reps. Copenhagen plank, 20 reps. Single leg tuck jump, 20 reps. Kickstand hinge oscillation in that lengthened position, 20 reps. Bring the glute to failure. Back to the single leg tuck jump, 20 reps. So there we're like fatiguing intramuscularly each group of tissues. So the hamstrings are getting fatigued, the quads are getting fatigued, the glute is getting fatigued, the calf is getting fatigued, the adductors are getting fatigued. But after each one of those, after we do the quad, we hop. After we do the glute, we hop. After we do the adductors, we hop. After we do the calf raise, we hop. After we do the hamstring, we hop. So each time you have a different body when you're doing that exercise. And I would use fatigue contrast for two reasons. One reason is, if someone is getting a bit of pain, we just like scramble it up, change the signal, like fatigue the shit out of each muscle individually and do the hop, and now you have a different body. So your body isn't going to react the same because now you have a different body each time you do it. So this is a, I spoke about this obviously earlier in the episode as well, or earlier in the conversation here. I spoke about this with regards to just contrasting. We're contrasting like a shit ton of fatigue in one muscle, do your hop. A shit ton of fatigue in another muscle, do your hop. So yeah, I've also seen people like tear their ACLs who have done like what I would consider, or what they would have considered like a decent rehab process. And looking in from the outside, I knew that I could see that their physio never got them jumping or decelerating under fatigue. They always did like their sprint work when they were fresh, their change of direction work when they were fresh, their plyometric work when they were fresh. And like I've had conversations with people who I asked them how their rehab went, and they did all these things when they were fresh, always when they were fresh, which is a good idea in the beginning, but not always a good idea. And then I've seen them, I've watched them on television, go back into games. I knew who was rehabbing them, and I've seen them tear their ACL in big games, and I knew that they didn't do enough work under fatigue. And we can obviously do our work where you're just tired in general, but we can also do our work, our plyos, our sprints, our change of directions where you're very fatigued in your quad, because there's potential for you in a training session to be down in a little huddle position and you're hunting for a ball, or if you're in rugby, you're like in a squat position and the scrum has to reset 5 times in a row and your quads are burning like hell, and then you have to go for a sprint afterwards. So there's potential for like one muscle to be really fatigued, but then you have to still put it together afterwards. So a fatigue contrast I would do if for a couple of reasons. One, to just train people to still manage a good collision under fatigue. Or two, if it's pain and I want to throw like a kind of a slightly different option at it, when yes, they're still good at these exercises. It's not the most disgusting pain ever, but it can scramble the signal a little bit. That's like if that pain just won't go away, it's kind of annoying us, but we can still do our plyos. This can work really well. And then three, yeah, those are the two main ones. And like it doesn't have to be a different exercise, a different muscle group all of the time. You could stick with quads. You could do a leg extension, single leg tuck jump. You could do a sissy squat, single leg tuck jump, like each after the other. So leg extension is 1, single leg tuck jump is 2, leg sissy squat is 3, single leg tuck jump is 4, split squat is 5, single leg tuck jump is 6, reverse Nordic is 7, single leg tuck jump is 8. So we're starting to like get the quads from every different direction and then jump afterwards. So I have no idea if this episode is useful for literally anyone. Except for the one person that asked the question, because most of the time when I answer a question, it's because I get it all of the time. Whereas this time I answered a question because I only got it once. I think I've only been asked, apart from that time I spoke, or those few times I spoke about fatigue contrast, I've never been asked about French contrast. So that was nice to get asked and hopefully useful for everyone. So that is the end of the episode. Feels like I just spouted word garbage for the last whatever it was, 37 minutes. So I really hope it was helpful. Give me some feedback. Let me know. Share it. Let me know. And apart from that, jump on DGR Interactive, the world's best biomechanics education platform. It's there. It's waiting. It's actually getting so much love recently from so many coaches because we've had so many people join and people are loving it. I think the library is now, the video library on DGRI is just in such a good state that no matter what you want to learn, it's there for you to learn. Spend 10 minutes. You have a client coming in later on that day. And let's be honest, like we all say, oh yeah, like we know what we want to do or something, but like we all have spent time going on Google and thinking, like looking for ideas of what I want to do with that client, or looking at anatomy and saying, I can't figure out what they're talking about there. Or yeah, so like that, if we're being honest, everyone does that. So instead of going on Google, go on DGRI and actually look at a solid thought process. And yeah, a little Netflix, choose your video, and I think you'll love it. So yeah, I hope that was helpful. That's the pod, and I'll chat to you guys next time.